thinking about it. All right, this shows me apparently a complete startup. So I'm going to go back and return to this slide where we were considering the development of a fertilized egg through those stages that we call embryo. So the morula, the blastula, the gastrula stage as the embryo that's multicellular, implants, meaning it attaches to the mother's uterus. The mother's body produces all of this accessory tissue to support it. We see it here in a full-term fetus showing, as soon as I can get the pointer going, showing the extensive placenta and umbilical cord, providing blood flow between the fetus and the placental exchange region so that the supplies brought in by the mother's blood can get into the baby's blood and by the baby's heart, which is beating, circulate around the fetus and support this development. In addition to the fetus, you have all of this fluid. This entire sac is filled with water. Water's heavy. A gallon of water is 8 pounds. And we have also this accessory tissue. You'll notice the crowding that a full-term infant produces. The only way this uterus can expand is if it pushes out against the soft wall, causing the distension of the abdomen that's so familiar to us. And that produces a compression, a crowding of organs. So here are all the small intestines all the way up here. And of course, one line would run down alongside the uterus to connect to the lower part of the large intestine and the rectum. But this is a development process which is generally late-term uncomfortable for the mother. There's another thing about this system that is kind of, I guess, counterintuitive as well. Birth is 1/2 of the survival of species. Individuals have to survive, but then they have to reproduce. So basically, live birth should be easy in order to maximize the chance that the species will survive. And in most mammals it is, but not so in the human being. And the reason is the development of the brain, our relatively large brain compared to our body size, and especially the overdevelopment of the cerebrum, have made this head very large. Now, we're still not committed to this. I mean, it could have been different where the baby is born at an earlier stage of development and the head develops outside the mother, but that's not what happens. This very large head will produce the main difficulty in delivering a human infant, and that is getting the head out of the birth canal. So late in pregnancy, you see a production of hormones from different sources that accompany the increase of mass of the fetus and the accessory tissues, and the placenta itself begins to increase its estrogen production, and that sensitizes the muscles of the uterus and begins them making experimental contractions, first very low intensity and far apart, almost anecdotal, but this increase in estrogen inside the mother from the placenta itself is responding to the stretching and the weight, and the increase in estrogens also increase the sensitivity of the smooth muscle fibers to oxytocin. Now that sensitivity will be important later. Relaxin is produced in the placenta, and its effect is interesting. It begins to relax the pelvic articulations, and notably the pubic symphysis, where the pubic bone comes together and there's that symphysis, that cartilaginous connection. That softens and begins to stretch under pressure. So a little bit of stretch at the perimeter produces an enlargement of the birth canal, aiding the delivery of the head. Now, in the fetus, the fetal weight grows and begins to, as always, stretch outward. All stretch receptors are activated. And within the fetus, the pituitary gland in the fetus releases oxytocin in response to this overall estrogen increase. The pattern is one of continual growth and stretching of the myometrium, and it begins to accentuate through positive feedback. It begins to accentuate the intensity and shorten the interval between the contractions. And this increases. It is joined by hormone production by the mother, so oxytocin is released in response to this estrogen increase. Oxytocin is released from the hypothalamus, and it begins to distort. This oxytocin release is going to be coordinated with later labor pains and delivery. Prostaglandins are produced as estrogens and oxytocin increase. Generally, I would say estrogens are the primary female sex hormone. Oxytocin is associated with two things related to reproduction. One is labor pains and labor of delivery, but the other is milk letdown. So finally, we reach levels where the labor pains begin to sustain and repeat at a shorter and shorter interval, and we go through 3 stages. Here's a fully developed fully developed baby, ready to be delivered. Head down position is ideal. The dilation stage refers to the relaxing of this cervix. A competent cervix is a circular muscle that will remain closed, basically, and will flex to remain closed, just like you would hold the drawstring on a bag, and to support throughout gestation, support the development of all this baby liquid and essential secondary tissue. This presentation or crowning is shown here as the cervix dilates to an acceptable level and the crown of the baby's head appears. The expulsion stage, there generally is a delay as the head works its way out of the birth canal. But once that happens, these bones, and there are bones in this body, but they're articulated and they can be moved easily. So typically after the head is delivered, the body sort of can be flexed back and forth and slides right out behind the expulsion stage. This brings a moment of relief, but after that, the placenta, which is a deciduous tissue, separates from the uterine wall. So this tissue is now served its purpose, and it is shed from the uterus. The uterus is now empty and begins a shrinkage process that lasts some considerable time. But the birth of the placenta, the afterbirth, is a time when normally the contraction and discomfort of labor is relieved somewhat. Once out, you go through different stages of development: infancy, childhood, adolescence, and maturity that are shown here. These particular stages of development in a female, the infant being, let's say, below 1 month, an absolutely naive and incompetent but independent life. So the ability to control muscles, or the ability to do something as simple as hold up your head or move your head in the direction of a sound, does not exist at first, but it quickly develops. So we talk about infancy lasting up to a year. You can see the difference between here and here. This infant is sitting on its own diaper. It is apparently maintaining balance, but it also appears to be holding its head up and independently and directing its eye toward the camera. So these early indications of the first physical skills that we develop are apparent here. Childhood is extended to the point of puberty. Puberty is where the body begins to process viable gametes. And in the female is shown here that monthly cycle starts, and ovulation is a repeated process clear through the fertile life of the individual. From puberty to the completion of growth, and this is showing 18 years. Usually by 18 or 19 years, our height is complete, but that's not the whole story. Even though we don't get taller, we're adding tissue and completing the maturation of the body. So it kind of depends what you adopt as the dividing line between puberty and late puberty development and early maturity. So as early as 18 years, but I've seen comments that growth really continues until 23, 24, 25 years. And then we enter a period of maturity, a long period of maintenance of the adult stature. Now, I tend to think of these stages as an interaction between cell division and cell loss. When we're growing, cell division is way above cell loss. During our reaching of maturity, there will be kind of variations. We'll grow slower at sometimes, and then we'll have a burst of growth. But at maturity, those two rates just about level off. In the absence of a catastrophic injury or a disease that sets you back, that may adjust that balance between cell loss and cell division. But in the absence of those things, your body pretty well is maintaining itself for a long period of time, certainly decades. And so at some point late in maturity, that level of cell loss creeps ahead of the level of cell replacement. As you begin losing cells, those particular factors, cell loss, produces the thing we call aging. That means you're not just getting older. Each year you have a birthday and you're a year older, but you start to notice a decline in function, and we notice a late life need for support and for maintenance care that was not necessary through middle life. Postnatal life includes nursing. In my lifetime, the attitude toward nursing has changed so dramatically. You know, in the 1950s, we were so into our science, and formulas for bottle feeding were available, and many pediatricians recommended or at least supported the transition of the baby from breastfeeding to bottle feeding as soon as the mother wished to do it. Breast milk, it turns out, is a kind of a highly evolved product. Milk is often referred to as the perfect food. It forms its own food group in our diet and is seen as a highly nutritious element of our food. Milk and milk products contain all of these nutritious components. But the breast milk of the mother, as produced in her body, also contains some immune properties, large quantity of lysozymes and enzymes with antibiotic properties. As long as the baby keeps nursing, there's a level of immune protection that's conferred because it's carried in with the breast milk. Now, let me be clear. The antibodies work in the baby's body to protect it, but the baby's body cannot produce the antibodies. Therefore, its effect is only in place as long as the baby continues to nurse. When that nursing stops and the last antibody is worn out and decomposed, the protections that were afforded during that period of nursing go away. The milk that is produced in the breast is produced in response to an enzyme called prolactin, but the milk letdown reflex is produced by a combination of oxytocin, the hormone that we mentioned before that related to labor, and the actual physical stimulation when the infant begins nursing. It will continue until that nursing stops, or weaning, typically 1 to 2 years in a human. So what we see is an interaction between the stretch receptors here in the nipple, sending a message to a spinal nerve, and up through the brain stem, eventually arriving at the hypothalamus, because this motor command is an autonomic command. This is one of those odd hormones. It's actually produced up here in the hypothalamus and transported down here to the posterior pituitary gland. The posterior lobe holds this hormone and antidiuretic hormone, ADH, but the primary controlling hormones, as you know, are here in the anterior gland. Oxytocin is released when this stimulation, this physical stimulation, triggers it, and basically it causes the milk in the lobules to move into the ducts and move to the nipple for flow into the baby. Infancy and childhood is affected greatly by our endocrine system. Growth hormone, adrenal hormone, and thyroid hormones are all ones that we've mentioned before as having a stimulating activity on the rate of cell division and cell differentiation, the robustness of our growth and our growth periods. They are not absolutely uniform. There are periods of slower growth and periods of higher rates of growth as our body proportions generally change. But at puberty, there's a more dramatic alteration as the prepubescent bodies of our offspring differentiate into male and female bodies with distinct elements of appearance and physiology. Of course, the primary sexual characteristic is what kind of gamete do you make, but the secondary sexual characteristics that appear begin at puberty. This continues until growth is completed, and through, basically then we go into a period of maintenance and fertility through our middle years. Aging, that point at which maturity gives way to a loss, a noticeable loss of capability, is called senescence. And that is aging. As the functional capabilities begin to decline, our homeostasis changes in dramatic ways, and it affects basically every organ system in the body. Along with this, sex hormone levels decline, and females go through a very noticeable stage called menopause. Menopause actually is simply the cessation of the ovulation cycle. Because ovulation is something that is a regular part of her life from puberty, perhaps it is more impactful when we notice the arrival of that event. Male fertility is somewhat kind of more obscure. We don't have outward manifestations of our sperm condition or our sperm provision. And so when it declines, it is, since it doesn't have any outward regular appearance, it probably has less an effect on males. It's a good thing here on this last chapter to perhaps review some of the effects of aging, and I think it's pertinent here because so many of you are in health occupation fields, and health occupation means that you will be encountering very large number of older patients in your professional practice. So understanding the changes they're going through and some of the impacts of the medical interventions that are being prescribed might be important. So starting way back at the beginning with the integumentary system, we mentioned that the skin's elasticity and its thickness goes down. Collagen in the skin is reduced. This produces an outward sagging, wrinkling of the skin, folding over. It is also thinner, so it affects thermal regulation. It is easier to cut or tear, and it is harder to heal. In the skeletal system, the rate of bone deposition relative to bone production decreases, and bones become progressively lighter and weaker. Osteoporosis is the name of this progressive decline. And when you combine that with the loss of mobility in joints, so not only does the range of motion go down as you age, but the feeling of moving your joints changes. They get sore. Typically all your life, if something was injured or sore, you rested it until it got better. And so if you pursue that tendency as you age, the resting means a further loss of mobility, further soreness, and you kind of spiral downward. It's one of those places where use it or lose it, it really does apply. Muscular strength and ability does go down with very frankly, the atrophy of your muscles, the loss of sarcomeres, and the waning of muscular strength. Coordination, memory, and intellectual function all decline. So the nervous system loses dendrites, loses neurons, physically shrinks in size and appearance. Facts, acquaintances become harder to recall. Reductions in the, by the way, and that affects everything from memory in the cerebral cortex to your special senses. Everything that a nerve transmission affects is affected by that kind of aging. Hormones, and many of the preceding comments we've made about aging are affected directly by the amount and the quality of the hormones produced. Our endocrine system begins to produce less hormone. There's less hormone circulating. Cardiovascular problems are well known as you age, and especially a double whammy, that your heart function declines and your vascular function declines in parallel. So through life, you're constricting blood vessels and depositing materials inside. That produces higher blood pressure and a higher load on the heart. And this is another one of those downward spiral effects. Wherever blood is deprived, a target organ suffers. The immune system begins to decline. Now, we have just gone through several decades of benefit from recognizing that some of our problems, our pains, our ongoing chronic pain might be due to an overreaction by our immune system. So there are many treatments now that suppress the immune system. But the other side of that coin is when you suppress it, you become more susceptible to pathology from infectious diseases or injuries. In many cases, an infectious disease is not defeated by the medicine. What the medicine does is hold off decline until your body's immune system can ramp up and take care of the problem. So to suppress it, you run into the disparities that we see in the current coronavirus epidemic. The characteristic groups, or the groups at greatest risk, are well described. Those that have ongoing medical maintenance or medical problems are in that list. The elderly are in that list. because of a partial compromise of their immune system. The lungs, our respiratory system, so vital on a moment-by-moment basis, go through all the loss of strength and loss of elasticity that we described for other tissues. So basically respiratory function decreases, and you can see the effect of the coronavirus, a respiratory disease that is can be communicated airborne, on the pandemic that we currently are experiencing. The digestive tract, loss of muscle tone, loss of muscle function affects especially propulsion. The decline of secretions in all glands affects the supplementation of the food stream as it moves through the body. So less acid, less enzymes lead to slower and less efficient digestion. Peristalsis and muscle tone in the urinary system, and a decline of the cardiovascular system affects both the kidneys and the ureter, so that urinary function is subject to late life impairment. And finally, the current topic, the reproductive system, declines and becomes inactive with a noticeable event in females as their bodies cease this 28-day cycle of single egg production and ovulation. And with the male's decline, which is, I think, most noticeable if you actually look at sperm samples and notice that the quantity of sperm delivered and the quality of those sperm both are declining on a time scale basis. Now, the male has a double problem in the, first of all, the production of sperm and its composition into a semen that would be capable of fertilization in the female tract. But also you have the problem of the prostate gland swelling, so that the sperm may be still capable, but you cannot deliver it during intercourse because of the constriction on that pathway. So that takes care of development, all my comments. And we're ready to start a discussion of patterns of inheritance. We know from really now very long-standing research that the nucleus of the chromosome, the nucleus of the cell, and the chromosomal strands that contain the DNA are those factors that direct our inheritance, our actual passage of traits. In human beings, we have 46 chromosomes in a normal person. There's very little tolerance of deviation from that number. We'll talk about the effects of this aneuploidy. There are many individuals, there are some individuals, a very low birth percentage, that have 45 chromosomes and are viable, or carry 47 chromosomes and are viable. However, this is an unusual condition that always carries some level of disability. So for our rule, balanced chromosome sets are an important quality of reproduction in humans, as they are in most animals. 23 pairs are carried in every somatic cell of our body. That includes the reproductive cells. It is only the gametes that those reproductive cells produce that have a reduced number. One member of each pair of chromosomes comes from the sperm, from the father, and the other chromosome of that pair comes from the mother. Another way of saying that is, if you look at the pair that I will call the number one pair, the biggest chromosomes in our nucleus, one came from the mom and one from the dad. And that's true all the way through 1 through 22 pairs. But the sex chromosomes have a variation. There is homology in the female. She carries 2 X chromosomes always, so she actually has 23 pairs of chromosomes. The male has a non-homologous set because the male is defined by 1 X chromosome and 1 Y. So the male carries 22 pairs that are homologous, plus an X and a Y. when we study the chromosomes themselves, it is actually just fairly recently that we could just pair up the chromosomes and tell them apart. And what is shown here is called a karyotype. Here is the term right here. A karyotype is a presentation of the chromosomes from a cell where the chromosomes are arranged in their homologous pairs and identified by number, and they are basically arranged from the largest chromosomes down through the sets to the smallest chromosomes. And here's number 22, the smallest homologous pair. And over here, by convention, we put the sex chromosomes. In human, you can see an X, which is a large chromosome. It's about the size of number 8. And a Y, which is much smaller than any other chromosome in the set. Because there's an XY here, we know this is a male karyotype. But in addition to the arrangement, you notice there are characteristics, variations of color up and down the arms of chromosomes that actually allows you to pair them up. So just looking at number 1 and number 2, you can see here in number 1 that there's a characteristic alteration of color. This has been color enhanced by a computer that works off of real wavelength differences. You can see these two chromosomes are large, but they have this purple terminus on each arm that is lacking here. You can also see that the alternation of colors up and down, which the computer assigns, is distinct for this pair and this pair. So noticeable agreement between homologous chromosomes. So the number 2 show this green, yellow, green region right on the lower, lower third. And this central region that is pink, and only its homologue has that same banding pattern. Now, these banding patterns for human chromosomes were developed and became widely available only in the 1970s. That seems like a long time ago to you. But up until that time, the similarity in size and centromere position only allowed us to arrange human chromosomes in groups. So if you go back in the older literature, what you'll see is these 10 are called group 1 because there's not enough variation. And when you stain them all black on a white background, there's not enough variation to actually say this one goes with this one, but not with this one or this one. This was group 2 and group 3 and 4. And then there were some individual chromosomes down here that you could identify. So this is a beginning of the activity we would call gene mapping. We know that this is the number 1 chromosome, and there's a DNA strand that's packed in this chromosome from end to end that carries a certain number of genes. The genes located on number 1 are all grouped together on a single group, so they tend to move as a group. If this strand goes this way, then all the alleles on this strand are inherited at the same time. That's going to affect inheritance. The patterns of inheritance that we see are broken up based on this chromosomal organization. If you have homologous chromosomes, as you see here, 1, 2, these 2 chromosomes will carry each a copy for a gene. So if this gene is the gene in humans, for example, for lactose tolerance, meaning the adult gene that allows an adult to digest milk products, it is carried in this position on this copy that came from the father. The copy from the mother carries a lactose gene at that position, which might be the same gene. If the DNA sequence is the same, these both would be red, and they would both convey the ability to make lactase in the adult. But you can see the different colors indicating, wait a minute, there's been a mutation to that red gene, and this is a different form called the recessive form. Now, this gets into genotypes. What happens if you have 2 chromosomes up here and each has a red? then you're going to get the lactase enzyme just fine. What if you have two chromosomes, each with the yellow? You can't make a good lactase gene, so you're lactose intolerant. But what about the combination here? You have one good gene and one mutant gene. What happens in this situation is that we have to recognize there are two genes that can make that lactase, and this one can. So this individual would be able to eat milk products, even though they are a carrier of the mutant gene. This relationship is called dominance, because the presence of one copy of the red makes this genotype a lactose-capable genotype. This two-copy genetics is true for all the genes in humans in chromosome pairs 1 through 22. Simple inheritance is affected by two genes, two copies of the gene. These are called alleles. When they're different, they have different enzymes that they produce. But there are also other genes. This is the simplest kind of inheritance, where those two alleles account for the entire phenotype. However, there are many more genes where not one gene with two alleles, but maybe 4 genes with 8 alleles or 10 genes with 20 alleles will affect the phenotype. These are called polygenic traits. Multiple genes affect things like hair color. Now, hair color is other than some pure recessive traits. Red hair and blonde hair are recessive traits. But things like skin color, things like eye color, things like height will often have a polygenic basis. Over here, we have a curious situation that develops from the inheritance of this mismatched pair, the X and the Y. So we call the pattern in the purple box sex linkage, or a better way of saying that is X linkage, because it refers to the genes on this X chromosome that do not have a corresponding gene on the Y. So what you can see here is that in the male, the trait that's expressed is going to be a result of one copy of the gene, one allele only. Now, contrast that with the female. The female has 2 X's. So the female can show this regular pattern and regular ratios of 2 gene inheritance. But in the male, it's determined by only 1. These are traits that typically appear more frequently in the male. Examples include red-green color blindness, hemophilia in some of its forms, male pattern baldness, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. Those traits that we associated with a male are often a result of this X linkage. This also tells us something about the family that that male lives in. Because if the male looks like this, where did this X chromosome come from? It came from his mother. So the X chromosome comes from mom, the Y chromosome has to come from dad. So we know there's a female to male transmission of a sex trait, which changes the ratios of the traits we see in the population. But when this male reproduces, if he contributes his X chromosome, it goes to a daughter. So there's an alternation of generations pattern that's set up by X linkage, from mother to son to granddaughter to great-grandson in this lineage. None of these traits will ever move from father to son, because if the X chromosome comes across in reproduction, the offspring is a girl. There are a few traits that we've identified that are located on the Y chromosome, and as you can imagine, every offspring of this male that is a boy will receive that trait. No daughters will receive the trait, but every son. When that son reproduces, every son of his, every grandson will receive the trait. So Y chromosome identifies a kind of a straight line from male members of a family pedigree. This is a great place to stop for this lecture. So I'm going to go through my steps and stop the recording.